Okay, so shifting away from this discussion of the various modes of reenactment, we finally turn to the thin blue line. And as I noted earlier, in the thin blue line, reenactment returns after its dismissal and disparagement during the heyday of observational documentary in the United States, the heyday of cinema verite, direct cinema, observational filmmaking, and so forth. Um, if we haven't seen the film, very, very quickly, the plot turns on it's a real world documentary discussion of a fellow named Randall Adams who was put into death row for the killing of a Dallas police officer named David Wood. The crime took place on a dark night on the side of the road in Dallas in the mid 1970s. What was supposed to be just a normal traffic stop turned into a killing of a police officer. And Randall Adams was convicted of the crime not long after and found guilty and sentenced to death. Errol Morris investigated this crime and came to believe that Randall Adams was innocent, and through a series of documentaries, through a series of interviews and then recreations of the crime, reenactments of the crime, it actually eventually helped to contribute to the release of Randall Adams in the late 80s in a retrial, and they looked at the evidence again and reconsidered the case, and the film was of course released in 1988. So I'm arguing here that the Thin Blue Line partakes of reenactment in these restagings of the crime, these reenactments of the crime, combining realist dramatization of the type that we saw in The Nook of the North or War Games, right? This construction of a realistic space, obeying in the sense the conventions of fiction, right? At this, creating a coherent space with continuity editing, but that also intersects with expressionism, which is to say, a world colored and inflected by subjectivity, by belief, by the values of the subjects who remember, who purport to remember to having witnessed the crime. So these reenactments are also inflected by psychology, emotion, by fantasy, distortion, and exaggeration. But and also at the same time, in this way, these reenactments have an overt or express acknowledgement of the fact of subjectivity, the fact of a specific point of view. As Errol Morris says in his article, Played Against Sam, quote, "The problem is that perception is endlessly colored by fantasy and belief, perception of the present as well as the past. If there is a story that we wish to believe, our perceptual apparatus will usually modify or reinterpret what we see rather than the other way around. We see things that do not exist and fail to see things that are right in front of our eyes. We often remember things incorrectly, and our memories themselves change over time." Here is the opening of The Thin Blue Line. We can see towards the end of this clip one of the reenactments of the shooting of David Wood.
In October, my brother and I left Ohio. We were driving to California. We got into Dallas on a Thursday night. Friday morning, while I'm eating eggs and drinking coffee, I get a good job. I mean, it's, all these people are supposedly out of work. I'm not in town a half a day and I've got a job. It just, everything clicked. It's as if I was meant to be here.
And I'd run away from home a couple times, once or twice, I don't know. And this all started, David's running away from home. I took a pistol from my dad's and a shotgun. Took a neighbor's car. I think I'd broken in their house or something and got the keys to it. I forget exactly what it was. Ended up coming to Dallas.
I went to work and no one showed up. Being a weekend, sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. On the way home, I ran out of gas. And as I was walking down the street with a gas can, a person at that time pulled over and, I guess since I had the gas can, he figured I was out of gas. I wasn't 100 yards from the car. And being Thanksgiving weekend, there was no gas stations open. So he stopped and asked me if I needed any help.
I'm driving down some street somewhere in Dallas. I just turned 16. And there was a guy over there, I think he run out of gas. I took him in to get some gas. This was Randall Adams. Ended up following him to his room where him and his brother were staying. Eventually that afternoon, we went out and got some beer and what have you, and we smoked a little marijuana and what have you. Went to a movie that night.
I get up, I go to work on Saturday, Why did I meet this kid? I don't know. Why did I run out of gas at that time? I don't know. But it happened. It happened.
So, in his article, Play It Again, Sam, Morris relates this intriguing story about a film critic who inquired as to how Morris could have possibly had his camera there on that night in the mid 1970s in Dallas to capture the crime. And Morris writes in his article about how he's completely taken aback and stunned by that film critic's comment because of its apparent naivete. But in a sense, this was a combination of things that Morris addresses, right? He says that this critic, in one way, is so committed to this sort of the cinema verite observational style of the documentary that a documentary must only be observational of an event as it happens, right? Of the present, recording the present. And on the other hand, it speaks for Morris to the reenactments themselves, which are so convincing precisely because they are so highly constructed with these incredibly precise close-ups and the lighting, the various setups, the camera setups, etc., the pacing of it, that it's at once, highly realistic insofar as the conventions of realism are observed, at the same time that it's highly expressionistic, as I said earlier. But these conventions of realism are at once very convincing because I suppose they're what we're used to, but they're themselves a construct, right? So Morris is here committed to producing meaning and to interrogating how we produce meaning, the methods by which we do it, which is to say that Morris therefore has a desire to make the world intelligible and to reveal its truths, but this desire and this revelation comes from construction, from confrontation and artifice, rather than simply through observation. Now, Morris is very articulate about this. So here is an interview from the late 1980s with Bill Moyers, in which Morris discusses the use of artifice and reenactment in The Thin Blue Line. And note, very importantly, that Morris says that he uses these reenactments not to show the truth, but rather to illustrate lies, which is connected to his point that he in fact never uses the reenactments to, quote, show what really happened.
I wanted to make a movie about, and I think at its core that's what The Thin Blue Line is, a movie about self-deception, about how we can convince ourselves that something is true even though it isn't, about how our need to believe what we want to believe is a lot stronger than our need to seek the truth.
In this case, you're talking about the authorities, the prosecuting attorney, the police, the justice system of a city.
The eyewitnesses, the surprise eyewitnesses who testified against Randall Adams.
That's scary. Did you set out intentionally to make a documentary? Or in the Hollywood sense, a movie?
I set out to make a movie. For a handheld camera and available light, I've substituted a camera on a tripod with very carefully, theatrically lit settings. All the interviews were done at one time, and all the reenactments were shot actually years later in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx.
Not in Dallas?
Not in Dallas. It's a movie that's very much constructed, put together out of blocks.
You said you used the dramatic technique. You used Hollywood lighting or film lighting. Tell me a little bit about that technique of interviewing. I'm curious as a journalist.
Well, this film has been described as the first non-fiction film noir. And it shares in common with film noir, the crime films of the 40s and 50s. It shares many of those themes, those concerns. You may remember many Hitchcock films about the wrong man, the innocent man who stumbles into some kind of net and can't get free. This is also that kind of story. It's a story about a man like you and me who one day met a guy, a killer, and his life was forever changed, and there was nothing that he could do about it. It's a very dark and very desperate story. And what I tried to do in making the film, in making The Thin Blue Line, was to convey some of that through my use of the reenactments, through my use of the score by Philip Glass.
See, those are two issues right there that concern the traditional documentarian. I come out of the traditional documentary style, and the traditionalists say, but you know, music is designed to create a mood, not to underscore a fact, and we can't use that.
Yes.
And reenactments are never permitted because it's someone's idea of what happened, not actually what happened.
Yes.
Are you concerned that by breaking the rules for a film that people think of as a documentary, you're pushing us, you're diminishing that line between journalism and imagination?
What I hoped in The Thin Blue Line was to call attention to that line, the line between truth and untruth, between style and the world out there. It's interesting, the reenactments in The Thin Blue Line are unlike the reenactments that I usually see.
On the television infotainment shows?
The reenactments in The Thin Blue Line don't purport to tell you what's true. They in fact illustrate lies. They illustrate fantasies. It's one of the sort of perverse aspects of this movie You asked me what I believe happened on that roadway. I believe David Harris was alone in that car and shot Robert Wood, but I never show it. I show everything but that.
And the reason being?
Because what I want to do in those reenactments is to take people deeper and deeper into the ambiguities of the case, not to show what really happened.
So you had to dramatize the lies that they were telling to get at the reasons they were telling them.
Yes.
And how they could be believed even though they were lies.
Yes.
That would have been hard for journalism to do, quite frankly.
Well, the thin line has been called Rashomon-like. I take exception to that. If what they mean is that everything is subjective, just thinking something makes it so, I don't believe that for a second. For me, there's a fact of the matter, a fact of what happened on the roadway that night. Someone sat in the driver's seat of that blue compact car. Someone pulled the gun from out underneath the seat. Someone pulled the trigger. Someone shot Robert Wood. And it was either Randall Adams or David Harris. That's the fundamental issue at the center of all of this. Is it knowable? Yes, it is. We have access to the world out there. We're not just prisoners of our fantasies and our dreams. I wanted to make a movie about how truth is difficult to know, not how it's impossible to know. And I hope I've succeeded in that end.
Thank you very much, Errol. This has been an interview with Errol.
So as I said before, Errol Morris is committed to a fact and that there is a truth, but the way of achieving access to this truth is through the use, among other things, of he marshals stills and maps and evidence and uses interviews, but he also uses at the same time, and with these, the techniques of fiction and studio film, such as carefully composed wide-angle shots and close-ups, to, in fact, interrogate the crime scene itself, the narrative of the crime scene, the fantasy of the crime scene, its evidence and its objects involved in the crime, and its retelling in memory, in narrative formations, all of these things that produce a kind of coherence, but these are also the coherence of lies. Right? So he's really, in a way, at once deconstructing a series of lies by representing them through modalities of fiction and using fiction to also get us, the strategies of fiction, to get us to also reflect on how we construct our memories and how we construct a narrative based on our fantasies. So finally, this takes us to Nichols's fourth category of reenactment, which he calls stylization, and I've appended to that the ironic form of ironic stylization. The Thin Blue Line, like so many of Errol Morris's documentary films, including the Academy Award-winning Fog of War, as well as his investigation of torture in Abu Ghraib in the documentary Standard Operating Procedure, they're all about a crime in some sense, a memory, and a point of view on that crime, a way of narrating it, and a self-deluding subjectivity and a narrator or a witness who constructs a fiction around it, a narrative around it. But there is a fact. There was a crime that happened, and there was someone accountable. So stylization in Errol Morris's use of the reenactment is a way for him to dramatize or to illustrate these delusions and these fantasies, and it is also a way then to comment on them. So this milkshake, in the scene and throughout the film, there's this attention to the milkshake that the police officer, Robert Wood, his partner, Officer Turco, was drinking in the car. And a lot of the narrative, the construction of how the crime took place revolves around where Turco was she sitting in the car drinking the milkshake, or did she exit the car and observe protocol and stand behind the car that they stopped on the road? A lot of this is interrogated through this object. But even perhaps more importantly, the milkshake becomes what Morris describes in his article as a metonym, a particular object associated with the crime that is used to help embody and to imagine, to produce itself a meaning about both a larger event of the crime and, importantly, the very idea of the crime itself, which is to say that objects and events become parts of a narrative and are used imaginatively and socially to constitute a crime scene, which, as Janet Walker points out in her article on the act of killing, is itself a concept, an artifice, and a construct with a history, right? That the crime scene itself was a sort of crimes all took place, actions took place, events took place, people were killed, but the concept of the crime scene and the protocols of forensic scientific evidence, etc., and the imaginary associations that also attach to that, and the pleasures attached to that, and the knowledge attached to that, that itself historically emerged in the 19th century, right? As Walker discusses, the concept of the crime scene. So this is also what this milkshake seems to gesture towards. So this takes us to the end of this slideshow. I welcome you now to turn to the second part of the lecture where we will discuss the act of killing and reenactment. Thank you.